There's a reason for that. The next speaker is going to be Justin Walker, who's going to talk about the forthcoming election and some ideas that we've got. Should we participate in the election or not? There are views on both sides, but we feel that we need to get involved, even though we don't agree with the system. But this is the story of Holly Gregg, who's a Down syndrome girl, and her mother Anne. And they contacted the UK column about 2.5 months ago, I think it was, with their story. We get a regular stream of people with stories about what's happened to them and their children or child stealing. But this one was so special, we spent quite a lot of time, went to meet Holly and her mum, and the story they told us was so incredible, we thought we had to broadcast it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Before I do, can I just ask for a show of hands of how many of you actually have read the articles that we've already published? Oh, excellent. Okay, so I don't need to talk for very long.
Right, David Ike's pushing it like mad, isn't it?
Yes, he is, yeah. Yeah. Now, the story goes back about 10 years when Holly Gregg, in fact it's longer than that, but when she was 6 years old, Holly Gregg started to be subjected to abuse, sexual abuse, by her father and brother, a High Court sheriff, Scottish sheriff, so equivalent to a judge, a police officer, social services people, her carer, and some other husband and wife teams. And altogether there was another 7 children involved in the abuse. So she was abused around a group of paedophiles on a regular basis. And she remained quiet because she came to accept what was happening as normal, but also she was threatened by her father at the time. Eventually, Holly told her mother what was happening, and that produced, not surprisingly, a rapid split in the family. And Anne Gregg was obviously so distraught as to what had happened with her daughter, now moving forward 10 years, over a 10-year period, that she went for help, and she eventually contacted both social services and the police, Grampian Police, expecting that there would be a rapid investigation into what had happened to her daughter. Well, there was a sort of investigation, but nothing very much happened. But what happened to Anne was extraordinary, because eventually a group of about 8 people turned up outside her flat. They included a police officer and a psychiatrist and somebody from social services and some other people. They talked their way into the flat, where Anne Gregg was forced to the ground. She had a needle stuck in her backside, and when she next woke up, she was in a psychiatric unit. And she spent, I think it was just about a week in the unit. She eventually got herself out with the help of some friends, and then the first thing she did is went and got a psychiatric opinion on herself in order to have a piece of paper that said she had absolutely no mental health issues, and she was a perfectly normal person. Now, that procedure was clearly designed to intimidate her. She carried on campaigning, and eventually, and bizarrely, the Criminal Injuries Board awarded her some, I think it was 13,500 or 8,500, I forgot the exact sum, but it was clearly designed to shut her up because the case had not gone to trial. And the reason it had not gone to trial was because there was a blatant effort by the Scottish establishment to cover up what had happened to the girl, because the abusers included people within the Scottish elite. Now, Anne Gregg has never given up, and last year she also tried to force another investigation by Grampian Police, which they didn't do properly. Holly is a reliable witness. The police have said that in writing. Social services have actually said that in writing, and the BBC have said it in writing, because at one stage the BBC were going to do a programme exposing the paedophile abuse of Holly. Then they suddenly dropped it. So Holly remembers in great graphic detail what was done to her, who did it, what was the relationship between those people, what their jobs were, husband and wife teams. She can identify all the other children that were present and also abused. And she's repeated that information to the police with a 6-year time gap. And a gentleman was there listening to her the second time that she was talking to the police. And he said her recall was nearly word for word perfect from 6 years ago. Now, there are some people that even when we started to publish what had happened to this girl, challenged us and said, oh, well, it's only her word. So I give you the other part of the story which we didn't publish, and that is that Holly was damaged internally by the abuse she suffered, and she was also given a sexually transmitted disease. So this is hardly her imagination. Now, we know that the block on the investigation of the case has come from the highest level of the Scottish establishment, and that's the Lord Advocate's office, the most senior person in Scotland. And there can be only one reason for the cover-up, and that is because the paedophile ring includes people at the highest levels of the Scottish establishment. Now, the case has exploded. We printed. It was distributed around Scotland, and then a friend of the family who's been trying to get the truth out himself, a guy called Robert Green, came up to Newcastle with us and on camera told the story and named the abusers. And what then happened was a Scottish law firm called Levy McRae put out an interdict, a Scottish injunction, to try and stop every newspaper in Scotland reporting this story. Why would you want to do that? And his client was the Lord Advocate herself, Eilish Angelini. We don't know whether she was using public money to pay for him to intimidate people with the interdict, or she was a private client, and we could not get that information. But what we saw was a massive effort from the Scottish establishment to cover up this case. Now, I'll only give you a taster of it because we can come back later. The action of leaving McRae solicitors caused huge angst amongst the Scottish media. And a little while ago there was another case, which is the leader of Glasgow City Council, a guy called Purcell, who suddenly came into the news for the fact that he'd been involved with drugs and drink and a few other things. And then a young 18-year-old man died on the steps of Glasgow City Council, and the two had been linked. One was adoring of the other. You can draw your own conclusions. But the same leaving McRae solicitor reared his head, a chap called Peter Watson, and he then pushed out another interdict to stop Scottish newspapers reporting this incident. But he got cocky and he made a mistake in the injunction, and as a result it was invalid, and that caused the newspapers in Scotland to say, we've had enough. They rebelled. And so reporters who'd been gagged by Levy McRae for some time decided that they would write about the law firm and Mr. Peter Watson, and suddenly, whoomph, he's out the country. Okay? Now, we've stuck with this story, and our point is that the evidence is all there that this very vulnerable girl was abused over a large number of years by a group of paedophiles, including judges effectively and police officers and social services people, and yet the Scottish establishment does not want the truth to come out. Why not? There can only be one answer, and that is because they're covering up, and they're covering up for people in very high levels of power. Now, we already know that the Operation Orr list of some 4,500 paedophiles had a 100-year gagging order put on it by Mr. Blair. Why? He must be covering up people. So we came to the conclusion that if this country had now got so bad, we cannot protect the most vulnerable people from this type of treatment. We don't have a society left. Every member of Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, was informed of this case. Every individual member of our Westminster Parliament was informed of this case. Not one of them, one man responded, which was George Galloway, with a rather obtuse response. One person out of, I think it's 643 MPs, even bothered to respond, despite the documentary evidence, the verbal evidence and the physical evidence that this Down syndrome girl was horribly abused. Now, our point is that if that is now our country, we are in an absolutely pitiful state. There's nothing else worth worrying about. If we can't protect the vulnerable and we can't protect our children, then it's pointless worrying about what's happening in your local council or the police. This is fundamental stuff. And Justin here was talking to some other people about the case a little while ago, and he came to the same conclusion, and he said, what would happen if we made Holly Gregg a single issue for the next general election? If you read the Conservative propaganda, Mr. Cameron has said on at least one leaflet that if you are trying to fight crime and being threatened, we can put ourselves in that category, the Conservatives will help you. That's what Mr. Cameron has said. Now, either he's delusional, he's been a bit close to Gordon Brown, or he's a liar, or he's both. But his own campaign material says that the Tories will help. And we know the same goes for the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party. So, we believe that if we lock on, there's another case I'll tell you about very quickly. We have another Down syndrome. He's a young man who in a weekend of care had a fingernail removed and 2 toenails. And the police have said categorically that the young man was tortured within a care home. And again, there has not been a proper police investigation. Now, we believe that if this is the level the country's got to, we need to make each and every MP accountable for this action, because if they won't get the police to investigate, to bring the perpetrators to trial and justice, then they are protecting paedophiles themselves. So our contention at the moment is, based on the evidence so far, where not one single MP has come forward to assist, offer help, or anything else, we have a Westminster, because it's more than just Parliament, a Westminster full of people who condone and protect paedophiles.
You're all guilty by association.
Oh,
Okay,
yes.
so I'm going to hand you over to Justin.
Brian, before you go on there,
Yeah.
please just tell them what happened with Robert Green
Right.
when he was arrested and he was in the police station and about the phone calls. What
Okay,
happened?
Robert Green, when he gave the presentation in Newcastle, as I said, he mentioned all the names. So, and we've got that video, and we should have time towards the end of the afternoon to put it on, and you can see part of it, certainly. He later went up to Aberdeen because he decided to stand as a parliamentary candidate. He got over the border, he was in Aberdeen, walking to meet some other people. He hadn't done anything, he hadn't handed out any leaflets. He was arrested by the police on breach of the peace, and that actually was a fraudulent arrest, which we can tell you about. But that was Friday morning at 9 o'clock. He was then spent the rest of the weekend in the police station. Now, during that time, thousands of people called Grampian Police to ask if he'd been arrested, why he'd been arrested, and whether he was being treated properly. And the police got more and more flustered. And we have the situation where civilians manning the phones for the police would not let members of the public talk to a police officer. Now that in itself, I believe I'm correct in saying, is a crime. You, as a member of the public, I as a member of the public, have a right to speak to a police officer when we ask to speak to one. But they were so flustered, they eventually ended up making a statement which the people on the phones repeated like a parrot. Now, eventually on the Monday morning, he was taken to Stonehaven, south of Aberdeen, in a closed court, was basically put on remand, and it subsequently ended up that under his bail conditions, he has to report to Warrington police stations three times a week. The police have entered his home, they've stolen his computer, they have stolen much evidence, which would be the evidence for what had happened to Holly and also form his defence. It's the most unbelievable story. The police can't investigate the paedophiles, but they can run a massive campaign to harass, arrest, threaten, intimidate a man who stood up with the courage to tell you what had happened.